Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. We begin in the name of Allah. All praise and glory be to Allah, and may His finest peace and blessings be upon His messenger Muhammad and his family and his companions and all those who tread his path. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make all of our actions righteous and make them sincerely for His sake, and not to allow any of His creation a share of our intentions. Allahumma ameen. May Allah Azza wa Jal purify our hearts and purify our homes and sharpen our minds and better our deeds and deliver us to the month of Ramadan. Allahumma ameen. So we continue inshallah with our third and final discussion in this series, at least, on the miraculous nature of the Quran. What makes the Quran so miraculous? So clearly a book from another world. So clearly the book of Allah that He miraculously brought into our world, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we spoke about the Quran as a miracle in terms of its linguistic wonder. It being a linguistic masterpiece that is not just unparalleled, but unexplainable. And then we spoke about the Quran in terms of it being a historical wonder, a historical mystery. How did all of the lost history that we are continuing to slowly come across, bits at a time for 1,500 years, all exist there with such surgical accuracy in the Quran? Tonight I just wanted to cover three subsets to complete our tour of the miraculous nature of the Quran. The first of them is the preservation of the Quran, that the Quran was preserved and remains perfectly intact from the moment Jibreel alayhi salam spoke it to our Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam until this very last prayer that you heard the Quran recited in, and until the end of time, forever long Allah Azza wa Jal wishes for the Quran to remain. How does that prove that the Quran is from Allah? That's a question. How is the preservation of the Quran a proof of its divine origins? So it's the only book that's preserved. Okay? Huh? And Allah foretold this in the Quran. So it is of the prophecies about the future that you find in the Quran, the fact that the Quran will remain untouched. Allah Azza wa Jal said in Surah Al-Hijr, "Inna nahnu nazzalna adh-dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun." It is us, we are the ones who sent down this great reminder, and we are the ones that are going to protect it. You know, some people say, you claim the books before the Quran have become distorted. And we say, no, you claim this as well. This is something agreed upon by us and you. But then they come back and say, no, but sort of the message is sort of there, even if it's in the words of man. You're saying God can't preserve His message? No, that's not the case. We are not saying God cannot preserve His message. We are saying God never intended to preserve the previous messages. You're projecting this assumption about God that He promised to keep those books intact. He did not, subhanahu wa ta'ala. He entrusted the previous books to the previous nations to protect them, and they failed. They distorted them for political expediency, for convenience, they distorted them. They changed them, right or wrong. And this ummah fell into almost every single hole that Banu Israel would fall into. The Prophet ﷺ told us that would happen, except the distortion of our book, not because we're a superhuman ummah, but because Allah said, this book, I'm protecting it. Yes, He protected it through human means, but He has assigned to Himself, guaranteed Himself that it would be protected, subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there would be no other. It was intended as the permanent miracle, the miracle of all miracles, the timeless one. And so Allah foretold this would happen, and unlike all the other books, it actually did happen. Right? وَأَنزَلْتُ عَلَيْكَ كِتَابًا لَا تَغْسِلُهُ الْمَاءِ. He said to the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, and I revealed to you a book that the water of the oceans cannot wash away? Why can't the water of the oceans wash it away? Huh? It's not just in the ink that goes in the paper. It's carved into the hearts of the believers, and we'll come back to this point. But when you compare the Quran to the previous scriptures or any form of writing in the past, or any form of even recital of the past, should it be expected to be preserved? No, because nothing else was preserved. That's the idea. The Quran should not be expected to have survived this long period because nothing else did. Is that clear? And the Quran was primarily taught orally and not written down, which makes it even harder, right? And the Quran was decentralized, meaning there isn't necessarily one central party that issues, certification that you know the Quran. This sort of spread organically. You just need to imagine. The people came to the Prophet ﷺ, or they came to the Sahaba after the Prophet ﷺ. They learned some Quran from them, right? They go back to their families, teach them. Their families teach those after them. And it continues to get passed on, open source. They say in technology, right? Or in software. That should lessen the likelihood of it being preserved. Not written, but oral. Right? And there's no centralization of it to ensure, it's going to be passed on. And then it's all still the same version. How? Some people say, no, but you have discrepancies in your Quran. You have qira'at. Well, first of all, these are not discrepancies. The qira'at, Umar brought the man to the Prophet ﷺ and said, hey, he's not reciting it the way I recited. He said, this is correct and this is correct. So the qira'at were approved by the Prophet ﷺ without getting into the details of the differences between qira'at and ahruf. And just, is there variation? Yes, there is variation. Is this variation arbitrary? No, it's not. But I want to just tell you for argument's sake, can you imagine there was an open-ended license? Like when someone says, yeah, but you guys went off into your own different qira'at recitings or recitations of the Quran. Shouldn't that mean that the Quran is even less regulated now? Is even greater expectation that it would get lost? If everyone's allowed to sort of do their own thing a little bit. You know what that would mean? And we always tell people, just play telephone. You give someone a sentence and you let it pass by the room. It's never the same sentence when it gets to the end of the room. And so the issue of the Quran having slight, nuanced, compatible, but variations in qira'at should make it even less likely for us to expect the Quran to be preserved, and yet it was. The fact that there's 10 qira'at and not 10,000, right? It should be 10,000 if it starts at 10 in the prophetic era, right? And some people also say that there are conflicting manuscripts. And if you rummage online, you may find some, claims to conflicting manuscripts. So what if there are conflicting manuscripts? What do I mean by that? The concept of a person making a mistake when writing exists even in the age of editing, and you have Grammarly and you have T9 or whatever technology is checking our text messages these days, and we're still saying embarrassing things and hitting send by accident, right or wrong? And so 1,500 years ago, someone miswriting something accidentally does not mean there's another variation of the Quran now, right? And this is no different, by the way. This is no different than someone making a pronunciation error in the recitation of the Quran. Because again, imagine decentralized. I heard the Prophet ﷺ say something, I wrote it down. I was distracted, or some ink splattered for an extra dot, if there were dots in that time. Think of the amount of things that could just generally go wrong. And this is why people say, and that they misunderstand the issue of the central authority, the Khalifa Uthman radiallahu an, when he burned the other manuscripts of the Quran, when he at a later time provided official copies to every city. So basically, the most competent reciters, when a lot of them died in a battle, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had Zayd compile the Quran from people who memorized it. Okay? This is just a brief overview for the sake of the preservation. And then it was kept with him, radiallahu anhu. And then when he died, with Abu Bakr, the one who commissioned it. And then it was inherited by Umar radiallahu anh. And then it was inherited by Hafsa radiallahu anha. And then Uthman radiallahu anh, he asked Hafsa for her copy so I can make copies and put them in every major city so that people and their personal copies can reference. Did I get that right? And then people started only making copies now from the one that is the official copy in the central masjid of every big city. Then they were called, people imagine it like, oh, you Muslims burned all the other copies. No. This is impossible because you have to burn a whole lot of people who had copies in their hearts. This is not how it happened. People volunteered to give up their copies just in case there was a discrepancy. They were called to do it. And even Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu initially had some resistance, but even he agreed. So everyone did this. And I know the concept of burning is like, oh, okay, that means there was something that needed to be shredded. Something, yeah, it did need to be shredded, but not because it was something scandalous. This is called a cultural misunderstanding, by the way. So that we don't put copies of the Quran in the same trash or dump that is soiled with impurities, the most honorable way to get rid of something that has something sacred on it in the Islamic tradition is to do what? To bury it and let it decompose organically, or to burn it. So this burning was not like, an inferno and like burning houses down that have Qur'ans inside them and burn the libraries, and not like this at all. And it's understandable why some people from the outside, by the way, may suspect this, because there were sort of very draconian, very iron-fisted methods to make sure they kept a handle on all of these distorted revisions and changes that were being happening under the government, by the government, through the church. They had to do that. Like the first man who translated the Bible out of Latin into English, William Tyndale, they burned him at the stake. They didn't burn the book, they burned the guy. He 1517, about that time, right? And so there is some paranoia and distrust of government. That's always normal. We get it. And the Christian experience especially, right? But the earliest manuscripts were burned essentially in goodwill so that no one had a suboptimal, copy of the Quran. That's it. And by the way, people are going to say, why wasn't the Quran preserved? Okay, it was in the chests, but why wasn't it in the books earlier? Well, the Quran was coming every single day. And also paper didn't exist. We need help imagining what it was like back then. For you to have the whole Quran written down, you know what you would need? What would you need? A U-Haul. You would need a U-Haul truck. Because you have them on big bones and big leathers of animals. If you're going to get 114 surahs in there, you're going to get, the 6,200 plus verses. It's going to be a mess. That's why no one had a pocket copy of the Quran, right? Logistically, it was not manageable. And so at a later time, these copies were made in full, and your own personal copy was your own personal copy. You had a little piece, and if you heard a good reminder from the scholar, you were going to write the reminder next to the ayah. Oh, this ayah means this. So does that not pose a possibility, a fear for you that in the future, someone may think that your commentary or reflection is actually part of the ayah? These were the types of reasons why people said, oh, alhamdulillah, we got a central copy now. Let's get rid of all this liability stuff. So any slip doesn't happen from my end, doesn't happen through me. That is the idea. That is the very high level of the Quran was absolutely preserved, the oral track to begin with, that the written track came from, and the written track was standardized, right? And people voluntarily gave up their copies in case they were suboptimal or otherwise, and that was it. Is that clear? So that's sort of the way that Allah saved this book from falling apart and being distorted and not being preserved the way the other books did. He did it. Allah is the one that gives life and takes life, but He has an angel that administers this for us, right? Or for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. He promised to preserve the Quran, but He had human beings careful enough to centralize it in a book, but also teach it generation after generation, from memory to memory, from heart to heart, by way of oral transmission. So that already is a miracle. That because you have no people that were ever able to do something like this. Then, let's not just talk about the words being retained. We also look at the effect of the book on the world. Not it simply remaining intact for the world. What did it do to the world? And then you look across the generations. Look at how the Quran shook the globe, transformed the planet. Like if we start just with the Arab, you take a group of disunited, primitive, murderous Arabs, and then they change their whole course of life, and they repent, and they become the best community brought out for humanity because of a book that they heard. Is that a simple feat or not? It's not a simple feat at all. Tell me what person has loved a song so much that they changed their entire life because of it? Or loved a novel so much, or a movie so much, or a play so much, or a book so much that they've changed their entire course of life because of it. This doesn't happen, right? Like you look at, I'll give you two examples. Jubair ibn Mut'im, radiallahu an, before he became Muslim and a Sahabi, he was traveling to Medina. Why? In hopes that he could ransom his relative that was taken captive by the Muslims at the Battle of Badr. So the Muslims were by a landslide victorious at the Battle of Badr. That's why Allah called the day of Furqan, the day when everything became clear. These people have divine aid. God's with these people. It's clear. 900 to 1,000 soldiers, they didn't come out ready to fight with any sort of readiness, and they still won somehow. So Quraysh is humiliated. Their leaders, almost all of them are killed off. So many of them are taken captive. So Jubair, in that atmosphere, contemptful, humiliated, he's traveling to Medina to get his relative back from the Prophet ﷺ. He says, I entered Medina at sundown, and they were praying their sunset prayer. And I hear, of course not just the Quran, but the Prophet ﷺ reciting the Quran. And I hear him reciting, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ. Were they created out of nothing, or are they themselves the creators? أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Or did they create the heavens and the earth? No, they have no certainty in what they believe. They have no certainty whatsoever in their positions. أَمْ عِنْدَهُمْ خَزَائِنُ رَبِّكَ أَمْ هُمُ الْمُصَيْطِرُونَ. Or do they have control of the treasure chests of your Lord, or do they have full power, full sovereignty to make decisions about Allah's treasures, His universe? He says, I should listen to these verses حَتَّى كَادَ قَلْبِيَ أَنْ يَطِيرُ, until my heart almost flew out of my chest. How do you go from that mindset, right? That rage, and to being someone enamored by this book and accepting the faith of the Prophet ﷺ and changing the entire course of your life? Umar radiallahu anhu, you may know the stories of why he became Muslim. He heard verses in Surah Taha. Other narrations say that he heard verses from Surah Al-Haqqa, and each time he was just blown away by them. And it's possible that sort of he softened gradually. That's where the multiple narrations are. It's not about like a weak narration, a strong narration. They're all like historical reports that we don't need to verify their transmission with the same degree of scrutiny. So Umar radiallahu anh was a man who despised the Muslims, and he would beat his slaves, and when he would stop beating them, he would say, don't think I feel sorry for you, I'm just tired. Don't get the wrong message. And when a woman saw him start to soften on her way to leaving Mecca for Habasha, and she saw as if he started feeling bad, starting feeling guilty, she told her husband, who was preparing for the journey, and he said, are you crazy? You think Umar is going to become Muslim? When Umar's dad's donkey becomes Muslim, then Umar might become Muslim, not before then, right? حتى يسلم حمار الخطاب. So, one historian actually mentions, non-Muslim historian, about how the Quran transformed Umar overnight. How Islam transformed Umar. He says, Umar, if you read his biography, you will say that this man will be dead before he's 30. troublemaker, starting fights in the streets, alcoholic, always getting into brawls. He would die of over drinking, or he would just pick a fight with the wrong guy or the wrong family and they were going to finish him off. There's no way this man was going to make it to 30. And then Umar becomes who? Umar becomes one of the 50 greatest human beings ever, according to Michael Hart, the American historian. Right? He says, this book is not greatest like I like you more than I like him. No, the people that had the greatest impact, influence in world history. The Columbia history of the world says that Umar was able to effect, to bring into, to materialize a greater bureaucracy than the Roman Empire that was there for generations. How? A man who was about to, self-harm to the point of being forgotten on a hill somewhere and dying off and probably not even getting a proper burial. How? So the Quran did this just with one generation. It took them, as one Muslim historian says, من رعاة الإبل إلى قادة الأمم. Right? They were the shepherds of camels, and somehow they became the leaders of civilizations overnight. How did that happen? It was by the book. What the book did for them. But that was only just one generation. You have now 14 centuries of this. Some of the greatest worshippers of Islam, some of the greatest thinkers in world history, some of the greatest generals and commanders, some of the greatest philanthropists are all people that were mesmerized by the Quran and devoted their lives to the Quran. Ibn Sina, some people say his philosophy took him a bit too far, and some of the scholars of Islam said he crossed the red lines and he left Islam altogether. Some scholars believe that he left Islam altogether. But they say also that Ibn Sina, this genius of a mastermind in so many of the sciences, used to read the Quran. He read the Quran 5 times in the last year of his life. It is very intriguing. It is very intriguing. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, leave the intellectuals, go to the worshippers. You guys know the story of Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, and hearing one ayah from the Quran, he changed his entire life, right? And he became known as Abid al-Haramain, right? The one who floats between the 2 harams, Mecca and Medina, for the rest of his life, to compensate for what he used to do in his past. He was a highway robber, right or wrong? A highway robber in a haram relationship. And so, you think about these thousands of luminaries, these thousands of lives, these thousands also of volumes of intellectual sciences, of law, right? All of this was produced by this one Quran. There is what book begins to compare with the potency of that Quran? It gave life to the world. There's a professor, and I won't get too deep into this. He wrote several books on this. A non-Muslim professor named Rosenthal, Dave Rosenthal from Yale University. He has a book called Knowledge Triumphant, and another book called, I believe, the Intellectual Heritage of Islam, or something to that effect. He says that so many of the sciences were on the verge of going extinct, like history and otherwise. Of course, we know science, then medicine, and all of that. And then the Renaissance came when Muhammad brought his book to the world. And the earliest generations of Islam, these sciences were gone. People had no desire to learn anymore. And then you fast forward it all the way till the present day, the interest and the grip that the Quran has on people. I know some of you might recall, I gave in a khutbah once, just many of the different accounts I personally came across of why people became Muslim through the Quran. When someone reads ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. There was a young girl actually, she picked up a free copy of the Quran because everybody likes free stuff, and she went home and she was locked out, and so she opened her book bag to start her homework. She realized, oh yeah, I picked up this free thick book thingy. So she was young. She said, I opened the book, right in the beginning it says ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is a book in which there is no doubt. She said, and immediately it stopped me. It said, who writes like this? And it lingered with me, this thought, until she got older and explored Islam, with a little bit, greater ability to do so. in her high school or college years, and she becomes a Muslim, right? The Quran continues to be the number one reason for people to have a lifestyle change, to become Muslim. And then there's memorizing the Quran, right? وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ. We have eased the Quran to be recalled. فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. Is there anyone willing to take heed? Every book in human history has a temporary potency no matter how strong. In other words, it has a debut, it sells in its first few years. Movies are the same way, right? The box office, and then it tapers off dramatically. The Quran never had this, right? It retains the excitement of its debut until today. Its opening weekend, it retains it. What do you think, and this is a good exercise that I like to do with people. What do you think is the number one most sold book in the English language? What do you guys think? Bible. Anybody got anything else, sisters? No, not the Quran. English. No, that's Shakespeare, man. Usually I get someone who says Harry Potter. Any Harry Potters in here? Yeah? So, in the last 50 years, the most sold book in the English language is the Bible, the English translation of the Bible. 4 billion copies have been sold. A very impressive number. I don't even need to get into, is this really supply and demand, or is there like a missionary budget to put a copy of the Bible in every hotel room? Let's leave that aside. Let's just leave it at 4 billion. Okay, let's imagine there's genuine interest. What's second place? Second place are the quotations or wisdoms of the ancient Chinese thinker Mao Zedong, if I'm saying that correctly. Okay? 400 million copies. It's already down to 10%. Between first and second place. Third place, for you Rowling folks, is the Harry Potter series. 300 million copies have been sold. That's pretty impressive because it's a newer book, right? 300 million copies. But second plus third, 700 million copies do not account combined for 1/4 of the copies sold of the Bible. It's pretty impressive, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you how many copies of the Quran are sold in Arabic. I'm going to tell you how many people in any language memorize the Bible cover to cover. No, I'm sure. If there's a Christian in Mauritania somewhere, he probably memorizes the Bible. Because they memorize the dictionary, these people, mashallah. They're amazing. Because, there's people scattered in the world who just they have photographic memories. They memorized the phone book back when there was a phone book, right? So you might have 4 or 5 people on the planet who happen to memorize everything they've ever looked at, including the Bible, okay? Are there 5 million people in the world who memorize the Quran? For sure there are, right? How about 5 million people in North America? How about just in the United States? I'm sorry, I mean 5 copies, right? I don't mean 5 million. Pennsylvania, yes. Allentown, yes. This masjid, yes. There are 5 people who memorize the entire Quran, right or wrong? Right? And so it doesn't begin to compare. That Allah has miraculously facilitated the recitation of this book and people's interest to memorize it. Someone shared with me a beautiful clip today of a brother after 3 days under the rubble in the Turkish-Syrian earthquakes. He's reciting Quran. He continues to recite Quran, and they're trying to tell him stand still, and he's just reciting the ceiling ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون. Right? What book has that kind of grip on the souls of people? What kind of book do people feel like it gives them value, it gives them life, it gives them meaning, it gives them fulfillment, it gives them enlightenment? Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَكَذَلِكَ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ رُوحًا مِّنْ أَمْرِنَا. In this fashion, we have revealed to you a spirit from our commandment. It's a spirit, it gives life to the world, intellectually, to civilizations, but even to people's souls. It just does something different, it's potency. The last circle per se, but just to bring the discussion full circle, there are so many passages in the Quran that constantly, if you're paying attention, force you to say, could it ever be possible that the Prophet ﷺ is speaking and this is not God? Right? It's just too intriguing. You know, like what? Like when the Quran is always mentioning other prophets more than Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? The idea, the claim, the allegation is Muhammad wrote the Quran. Muhammad spoke the Quran sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, if he did, you think he'd include his name in there more than 4 times or 5 times? It's 5, right? That's it, 5 times. Muhammad and Ahmad 5 times. How many times is Moses mentioned in the Quran? 134 times. How many times is Jesus mentioned in the Quran? How many times is Abraham mentioned in the Quran? Alayhimus salam. So much more. You'd think his name would be there, right? Or here's another one. Dr. Shadi al-Masri, Allah yahfadhu, from New Brunswick or North Brunswick, he says, can you imagine? Imagine you write a book and you celebrate all of these women like Maryam and Asya. You don't mention your mom's name, you don't mention your wife's name, you don't mention your daughter's, you don't mention any woman from your family's name. You'd be in big trouble. Right or wrong? But they knew this book was not from him. They knew this was from Allah Azza wa Jal. It was crystal clear. It couldn't have been. Or here's another one. Can you imagine, this was also from Dr. Shadi. He says, can you imagine the Shaykh of the masjid getting up on the mimbar and just airing out his dirty laundry to you and talking about the marital drama that happens in his home? The Quran did that. Right? Surah Al-Tahrim, Allah Azza wa Jal says that, you know, Aisha and Hafsa sort of did a little plan because they were jealous of Zainab, and فَعَرَّفَ بَعْضَهُ وَأَعْرَضَ, and so he pointed some of it out to them and he ignored some of it, alayhi salatu wassalam, and then he said to them, Allah will inform me if you don't inform me. And who would do this if they were the ones writing the narrative? Yes? But he was the subject through which, the prism through which we had to understand our religion, so his life had to be on full display. Even the challenges, so that we know how to deal with them. Right? Or you think about all the ayat in the Quran that say Muhammad was just a prophet, just like the other messengers, alayhi salatu wassalam. Everyone who's trying to like bring a message to the world, they tell you, I'm unique. And that's why they have these clout chasing, clickbaiting thumbnails on YouTube, right? I got something top secret, something extraordinary. قُلْ مَا كُنْتُ بِدْعًا مِّنَ الرُّسُلِ وَمَا أَدْرِي مَا يُفْعَلُ بِي وَلَا بِكُمْ. Say to them, O Muhammad, I'm nothing new among the messengers, and I have no idea what's going to happen to me or what's going to happen to you. Of course, this was an earlier verse before Allah revealed to him, you know, some of the outcome. But who would ever say that if it were coming from him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam? Or who would say that they were embarrassed of certain declarations the Quran was about to make, or not embarrassed, like ashamed of the Quran, but discomforted and concerned about something that the people are going to use against him, alayhi salatu wassalam. Referring to the incident with Zayd radiallahu anhu and Zainab. You know, Allah Azza wa Jal wanted to abolish abortion. Adoption. Long day. Adoption. And of course, Islam emphasized greatly the caretaking of the orphans. But by adoption, we mean absorbing someone into your family and deleting their ancestry as if they don't have their own families. That is an injustice to those people. They have a right to know, and there are rights based on these things. Maybe somebody owes me a few $1 million, right? And so on and so forth. And so, the strongest way to do that was in practice, not just in statement. It was done in statement. أُدْعُوهُمْ لِآبَاهِمْ هُوَ أَقْسَطُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. Attribute them to their fathers, their paternal ancestry. But then Allah had the Prophet ﷺ marry the ex-wife of his adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, which is a more emphatic assertion, establishment that he's not my son. Adoption is not what we think it is. You get it? And so if I'm marrying his ex-wife, and I can't marry my son's ex-wife, therefore he's not my son. So Allah Azza wa Jal said in the Quran, فَلَمَّا قَضَى زَيْدٌ مِّنْهَا وَطَرًا زَوَّجْنَاكَهَا. So when Zayd finished his relationship with her, we married you to her. We married you to her. Yes, زَوَّجْنَاكَهَا. لِكَيْ لَا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ حَرَجٌ, to the end of the ayah. The ayah after it says what? وَتُخْفِي فِي نَفْسِكَ مَا اللَّهُ مُبْدِيهِ وَتَخْشَى النَّاسَ وَاللَّهُ أَحَقُّ أَن تَخْشَاهُ. And you hide within yourself, O Muhammad, what Allah insists on making public, and you fear the people, like the reaction of the people. They're going to say Muhammad's making up his own rules just so he can marry someone that he was fond of, and so he made his son divorce her so that he can, you get it? And so you're hiding within yourself what Allah is going to make public, and you're fearing the people, and Allah has more of a right to be feared. Aisha radiallahu anha says on this ayah, if the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam were to hide anything from the Quran, he would have hid this ayah. Right or wrong? This is the greatest proof the Quran is not from him. Allah is saying, and you're supposed to be fearing Allah Azza wa Jal. And there are incidents like this. You know, in the captives of Badr, he freed them. His default was compassion and clemency. So he let them go. So many of them without anything at all. Some were ransomed and some were just unconditionally freed. And Allah Azza wa Jal reprimanded him, you had no right to do this. You should have waited till the verses came down. And so Umar came and saw the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr crying. Why are you crying? The Prophet ﷺ tells him the ayat. What are the ayat? The ayat reprimanding him sallallahu alayhi wasallam for doing this too quickly. Or finally, the last verse I'll mention, عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى أَنْ جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى. Right? He frowned and he turned away when the blind man came to him. Like the blind man didn't know that he frowned, alayhi salatu wassalam. And the reason he frowned was not out of arrogance or not wanting to associate with a visually impaired person. He frowned fearing losing the opportunity to talk to the elites, because humans are followers, and so if the elites become Muslim, everybody becomes Muslim. And also because you're already Muslim, let me just try to get these guys, on the ship, right? Just hold on. So he was upset at, the interruption. And so Allah reveals, and he didn't see it. The blind man didn't see it. He frowned and he turned away when the blind man came to him. وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَّكَّى. And how do you know? Maybe he will actually be the one to purify himself, elevate himself with this message. Don't give too much attention, Allah said, to the people who don't want it anyway, and ignore the people that are coming looking for it. And so you'd think now the Prophet ﷺ teaches people to recite in their salah. He frowned and he turned away when the blind man came to him. Could that be your book? Could that be a book you're authoring? No way. And so we'll close out, inshallah Azza wa Jal. So Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, all in all, right? He says, فَأَيْنَ تَذْهَبُونَ. Where are you going to possibly go? Where do you go with all of this? What we spoke about 2 weeks ago and last week and here and now, and what we haven't discussed, it was just an avalanche of compelling reasons to submit. So where are you going to go? إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ لِلْعَالَمِينَ. It's but a reminder for all the worlds. لِمَنْ شَاءَ مِنْكُمْ أَنْ يَسْتَقِيمَ. Not for everyone. This book is not for everyone. It's for those of you who are actually looking for truth. Those of you who are actually looking to ride the straight path, to live an upright life. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. That's of course a threat. You don't will except that Allah wills, Lord of the worlds. You recognize it now, or else the glimmer of truth, the sparkle of truth will stop shining in your eyes. If you don't respond to it, you don't appreciate it, you need to know it's by Allah's permission that you recognize even something as clear as the Quran. To recognize it as truth is still by Allah's permission. So don't take it for granted. وَمَا كَانَ لِنَفْسٍ أَن تُؤْمِنَ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. A soul would never believe without Allah's permission first. And so if you will to take the straight path, Allah placed that will inside you, act on it, He's telling them. Otherwise, all the proofs and more will still fall on deaf ears and not move anything inside you. May Allah Azza wa Jal protect us from His guidance, and allow us to better appreciate His book and make it the spring that quenches our hearts and feeds our hearts and enlightens our chests and does away with our sadness and removes our distress. Allahumma ameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.